trade, competitiveness, private sector development. Anushka is also a co-founder of the Center for Smart Futures. Anushka, thank you for joining us today. Clearly, this is a dual crisis. One can't be separated from the other. The economic collapse led to the demands for political change, among other reasons. And right now, we're seeing the country in probably the worst economic shape in decades. So let me leave it to you now to give us your brief on how we got into such a parlous state in Sri Lanka, and what do you see as possible solutions for reform and change? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prakash. Could you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me well? Great. Prakash, Alistair, and everyone at the Australian Institute for International Affairs, Victoria branch, it's a pleasure to join all of you. I'm going to take you through a few slides just to anchor my remarks and help everyone follow my remarks. Prakash, if you one more thumbs up, if you can see the full screen slides. Okay, great. So let me take you through just some features of the current economic crisis and a few outlooks for the near term. So currently, economic conditions are dire, probably a gross understatement there. Some of the features of the current economic conditions primarily is heavily depleted foreign reserves. So Sri Lanka now has around $50 million worth of foreign reserves. Actually, since I put these slides together, it's gone down to probably a couple of days of foreign reserves to finance imports. Yes, inflows from exports do continue, but it's more than, our import bill is more than double our inflows every month. Remittances, foreign worker remittances and tourism earnings have remained quite tepid, and we are likely to see foreign tourists also taper off with the ongoing ground conditions. The oil import bill, Sri Lanka has been facing high imports already with global commodity prices having increased, but particularly following the Russia-Ukraine war, oil import bill that Sri Lanka has to face has substantially increased, and this has been compounded along with the shortages. However, the good news is, in a way, that the debt standstill, which the government adopted, the unilateral debt standstill that the government adopted in April, means that the monthly outflows that go to servicing debt, coupon payments coming due, etc., no longer has to go out for debt repayment and can be channeled to finance essential imports. As Bhavani mentioned, there's a severe shortage of major essentials, fuel, cooking gas, medicines, and medical equipment in hospitals, and food items. Domestic food prices are soaring. Consumer price inflation in the month of April topped 30%. These are historic highs for inflation and the cost of living. They have been driven by both domestic shortages due to agricultural production getting affected by a policy decision, rather myopic policy decision taken last year to ban the use of agrochemicals. These high prices are also being affected by high import prices because the rupee has depreciated substantially, and also because of shortages of imported food items because of a lack of foreign currency. The banking sector, I have a couple of roles in the Sri Lankan Financial Services Institution, so I thought it important to provide this as well, given how important the banking sector is to economic health. The banking sector has been pushed to the brink. So far, they remain stable, but there's a severe US dollar liquidity shortage. And because the Sri Lankan sovereign rating was downgraded so much, counterparty banking limits between Sri Lankan banks and the overseas banks have been capped or cut. Now, all of this comes on the back, these current economic conditions come on the back of an already weak economy. COVID-19 severely impacted growth, economic activity, reserves, and fiscal space. Tourism earnings and remittances were the worst affected. Export manufacturing was affected by multiple shocks, starting from when the pandemic first hit and supplies from China weren't coming. Then you had the foreign market demand shock in Sri Lanka's key markets of the US, UK, and Europe. About 60% of our exports go there. Then we had the domestic COVID waves, and now the domestic shortages, which are affecting production. The fiscal position of the government was also weak prior to this current crisis because of some very short-sighted tax cuts that were made in late 2019 following the election of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, fulfilling an election promise. And this was, despite all good advice, this was done. And it meant that during the COVID-19 pandemic, the coffers the government coffers just did not have money to provide COVID-19 relief. And it also meant that our ratings were downgraded and Sri Lanka got locked out of international capital markets. So since early 2020, Sri Lanka was not able to roll over its international sovereign bonds by issuing new bonds or raising new credit because of the ratings downgrades. And finally, another feature of the weak economy before this current conditions was that agricultural output had been severely affected, creating domestic food shortages and farmers in distress because of that overnight ban on the use of agrochemicals, which subsequently was reversed earlier this year, but due to the lack of dollars, fertilizer hasn't really been imported back in. So what's the outlook moving forward? I'll share three aspects of that. On some of the macro elements, interest rates are now close to between 20 to 24% market rates. And these interest rates are likely to remain high for the rest of the year. The currency, the rupee, has depreciated substantially since it was a free float was allowed. By the way, just as a side note, the central bank artificially held the currency for about a year, and this hemorrhaged foreign exchange markets. Since then, the rupee has been allowed to free float, and it's now at approximately 360 or 70 rupees to the dollar. It's likely it'll hit closer to 400 before strengthening or the tide is stemmed a little bit. Export manufacturing, while taking advantage of the depreciation of the currency, it is affected, on the other hand, by the domestic shortages, and unfortunately may not be able to take full advantage of this highly competitive currency. And supply shortages, I expect, would continue for at least a couple of months more. And easing of this will depend largely on whether Sri Lanka receives some emergency credit lines from donors. On the recovery and reform pathway, the debt restructure talks. So, Sri Lanka did a unilateral standstill of its debt without soliciting letters of consent from its bondholders and other creditors. So now the somewhat messy and arduous journey of debt restructure talks with its creditors will begin soon. Discussions with the IMF on a potential bailout package has already begun. And it's likely that even while those are going on, Sri Lanka will receive some bridge finance from bilateral and multilateral donors. It's likely that under an IMF program, there will be some substantial austerity measures, fiscal adjustment, both higher taxes and lower government spending are likely to be big features of this adjustment. And given that the government has played a large role in the economy, huge public spending on infrastructure, stimulus measures, easy monetary policy, government projects being prominent in economic activity, I would imagine that any pullback of that in this fiscal adjustment is going to leave quite a activity vacuum, and will have an effect on demand. And frankly, my concern, and I wrote about this in an article for the East Asia Forum at ANU recently, my concern is that the ongoing political instability will make this adjustment and recovery pathway quite messy, because in the eyes of the public, public legitimacy is not, this government does not have public legitimacy. So any program of reform, any program of adjustment with the IMF or any other multilateral entity will not be acceptable as long as it's signed on to by the folks in power today. Finally, I think a concern, a big concern right now, and perhaps Samanthi will talk a little bit about this as well, is that households and workers are extremely vulnerable. Already during COVID, the vulnerable population groups were really pushed to the brink, and helping them to keep their head above water will be extremely important. The government with existing money, the Exchequer does not have the fiscal space to provide that kind of relief. So it will have to rely on multilateral and bilateral assistance. Frankly, right now, many parts of the country need humanitarian assistance. There are families who aren't eating more than a meal a day. Cost of living will remain high. And I think it's safe to say that the current crisis will have lasting human development effects on nutrition, health, and sanitation. And so through this current crisis and any adjustment, fiscal adjustment that happens, it will be critical to ensure that vulnerable population groups are helped, but being very cautious that it won't be done through existing welfare schemes, which have become hugely politicized. And we heard yesterday that one of the pro-government mob members who were unleashed on the anti-government supporters, when this individual had been kind of trapped and accosted by the peaceful anti-government protesters when they were attacked by this individual. And they asked him, how much were you paid? What were you given to join this? He said, I wasn't given anything, but they threatened to hold back my social welfare benefit, Samurdhi. I'm a single father and I won't be able to feed my daughter. They threatened to hold my government-given social welfare benefit back. They held it at ransom, so I had to join this mob. So I think using existing mechanisms to give relief is not going to help. Thank you, everyone. Prakash, over to you.
Well, thank you, Anushka. That was so much to pack in. So